Good Thanksgiving morning, and welcome to one of our vlogs from St. Mark's Episcopal in Dalton, Georgia. I'm not in Dalton at this time. I don't know if you can tell behind me, but in the far ways you can see Lake Hartwell on the South Carolina-Georgia line. And I'm headed off to visit family, and on Thanksgiving Day, as many of you probably did when you finally see this. This morning I talked a little bit about St. Francis of Assisi, and we all know about him and his he's the patron saint of animals and the environment, but also he's very devoted to the Eucharist, and I've come on a lot from him there. But St. Francis of Assisi was had the vows of poverty and chastity and obedience, and he dressed accordingly. One of the most famous parts of his story is the conversion that happened to him when he was at a little chapel of San Damiano in Italy. Now it's very run down, and he heard a voice from God saying, "Go and repair my church." And St. Francis thought he was talking about that particular chapel and other chapels that were in ruins around Italy at the time, but eventually he understood that God meant for him to improve and reform the churches at that time that were in need. And in church history, we have many people who were called to do that. John Wycliffe in the 1300s in England, and Martin Luther, obviously, and Ignatius of Loyola, and even John Wesley, and many others who part of their life's work was to reform and improve and reassess the church and make the church better. In the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 16, Jesus, talking to his disciples, he was in Caesarea Philippi, and he asked the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him from the prophets, John the Baptist or Elijah or Jeremiah. And then he asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter, as he normally did, spoke up and said, "You are the Messiah," or "You are the Christ," depending on the interpretation. "You are the Messiah or Christ, Son of the living God." But Jesus says something very particular that we sometimes miss, because Jesus says, "This was revealed to you by the Father in heaven." Now the next few verses don't happen immediately, but Jesus is speaking about his death, and Peter talks to him and says, "No, say this isn't so. You shouldn't be saying things like this." And Jesus rebukes him. He says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." And this is soon after he says, "You are the Messiah." Jesus told him, says, "You are Peter. On this rock I will build my church." He is very clear about that. But then he says a few verses later, "Get thee behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block." But what he says after that is much more important. He says, "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." You don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Now, even though God's church is God's church, and it's not our church, it's God's church, but it's run by people, and very fallible people. So very often, and in fact always, the church needs correction, the church needs to be reassessed, church needs to be improved, and we all understand that, we all have ideas about this. But Jesus instructed Peter what should be the guide for this continual reassessment. It says, have in mind the concerns of God, not merely human concerns. So the church needs to be rebuilt, it needs to be reassessed, but this reassessment and this rebuilding needs to point towards God and God's kingdom, and not towards man's concern. So when we say for this assessment, and we say this Thanksgiving Day, thanks be to God. Hallelujah.